Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Jeremy Horpel. I teach economics here at UCA, just over in the College of Business, just across the way. And I teach a lot of introductory classes like Principles of Microeconomics. So I think I do, in a normal semester, deal with maybe students that have maybe taken a class from one of you, and then now they're a freshman at UCA and are taking the economics class again. So I think I've kind of faced some of the same challenges and same moments where students get things, and that's very exciting. So I'm trying to show you today a module that we've worked on and have adapted from the Southern Methodist University, which teaches a lot of things. But we're going to try to keep this very interactive. As Terry said, we have a long day of a program, but we've tried to, for each of these, break it up. So I'm going to lecture for about 45 minutes or so, but feel free to interrupt if you want during that time. But then we will have about a half hour after this to go through an activity, and there'll be, I think, plenty of time for questions there too, or comments that you have. So I'll try to proceed through the lecture, and then feel free to interject as we go. And that'll be how most of the day will go. You'll have a lecture, then an activity, and then for the last unit, I think it's going to be almost entirely an activity of the trading game. So this module is one that we call Time Well Spent. It's actually based on an article that was published by the Dallas Federal Reserve back in 1997. So now this is the original article was over 20 years old. So one thing we've done is kind of updated the data to make it as close to the present as we can. Data is always a little bit behind. But this is I think, I've read this many times, this article. We've used it in class to have students look through it. And I think there's just so much in it. It's just very exciting every time I read this. Not only is there kind of this kind of labor market stuff and consumer choice, but also buried in there there's things about economic growth, and there's things about economic history, which in addition to teaching microeconomics, I also teach economic history, so I like to try to sneak that in for students whenever we can. So there's a lot in this, although the core of this module is actually very simple. It's all just based on a very simple calculation of how much does it cost to buy something, not in terms of money, but in terms of hours of work. So we're going to try to look at a lot of different products, look at some current prices, past prices, but then we're going to try to say how much does it cost to buy things, but the thing we're going to use to measure that is going to be people's time rather than money. Money is kind of this weird thing which when students come into your class, they've lived a whole life of using money all the time, but they don't really understand it, but they use it correctly for the most part. But they don't really understand what it is. And I think when you try to talk about fundamental concepts like economic growth or labor markets or consumer choice, if you're dealing with money, that actually adds a layer of confusion. If we take the money out, I think it does make more sense for them, at least if they're willing to ignore the money for a moment. But we will have some money in here too. But it's always good, I feel, to start with a couple quotations from prominent people that say what I'm doing is correct. And the best one to pick is always Adam Smith if you're doing an economics class. So here's what Adam Smith had to say about this. He said, "The real price of everything is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What is bought with money is purchased by labor." Right? When you use money to buy something, what you're really using is some labor that you sold to someone at some point in the past. They temporarily gave you money, and now you're using that money to buy things. So the money is just an intermediary. What you're really purchasing with is your labor. Here's Thoreau, who said it a little more eloquently. He said, "The cost of a thing is the amount of life which is required to be exchanged for it." Right? That is the actual cost of something. How much of your life do you have to give up to get it? All right, so here's our first example. And I think this is one where sometimes students I think students have some idea that things weren't as great in the past as they were today, but I think when you start going through some of these examples, they really start to say, oh my goodness. This is a top-of-the-line 1971 television, the Sony Triniton. It's a color television. I think students think, oh, in the 70s and 80s, it was all black and white TVs, right? Well, most TVs were, but there were actually color televisions. So you might think this is kind of like a top-of-the-line TV from the early 1970s. A lot of the examples I'm going to use actually go back to the early 1970s. I think this is a really important time to look at in our nation's history. Because if you look at, say, a series of wage data over time, and you do something called adjust it for inflation, which is this magical thing that we all know you should do, but no one really knows what it is. But you adjust it for inflation, okay? If you look at wages, they haven't really increased very much since the early 1970s. I think some students even kind of maybe heard this and know this, that if you look at wages over time, they're kind of flat since the 1970s. which would seem to indicate that, well, things for the average person haven't gotten better since the 1970s. I think when we start to look at both what products were available and how much time it took to purchase them, it seems like that statistic can't be completely right. There must be something more to the story. So some of the examples, we're going to go back to the 1970s here, go back in our time machine. So here's the 1971 Sony Trinitron television. We'll use it as an example to see what we're going to do with this whole module. Here is the price of it. So here we will use money. The price of that was $620. That's in 1971 money. That's not in today's money. And I think students already will know that the money wasn't worth as much back then. This TV, which I think this is a 21-inch Sony Trinitron color television, was $620 in 1971. Here's another important thing. Average hourly wages for the entire nation in 1971 were $3.57 per hour. So again, and that's in 1971 money, right? We're not going to do any inflation adjusting here. So the adjustment we're going to do, though, is to say, okay, simple division here. That would mean that someone earning the average wage in the United States that would like to purchase this television would have to spend 174 hours of work in order to purchase it. This is going back to the quotations earlier. This is the amount of your life you have to give up in order to obtain the thing, in order to obtain the television. Right? So it would take 174 hours of work to obtain that. So first of all, just to get students to think about that. Okay, that's a number. They can kind of put that in their head. Maybe for some of them, that's an entire summer's worth of work, perhaps. Right? 174 hours. Right? You have to work an entire summer to purchase this. You might say, well, they'd say, well, but the money was different, the price is like, no. An hour is still an hour, right? An hour in 1971 is equal to an hour today. And so, the kind of work you might be doing might have been different, right? But, kind of the summer jobs a student might have today are actually probably very similar to the 1970s, right? They're probably working at a restaurant, or they're working, doing some sort of outdoor landscaping or lawn mowing, right? It might be very similar kind of work to the 1970s. And an hour is still an hour. So here's how many hours you would have had to have worked to purchase that. All right, so we're going to go through a number of examples where we look at that and then say, how does that compare maybe to even further in the past? And how does it compare to today? What we're really measuring here, and this is something you might have got to in another one of your lectures you might have done, or other one of your modules, we're really kind of measuring productivity, but in kind of the inverse way. So normally you think of productivity is how much can you produce per hour. So you might talk about the productivity of a worker, might talk about the productivity of a firm, right? How much do you produce, Q, the output, per hour, output per hour. Here we're going to just flip that over and say, how many hours does it take to produce a product, or to purchase a product in this case? And we're going to, instead of calling that the inverse of productivity, we'll call that the real price of something. The real price is how many hours does it take to work in order to purchase something. So if students are already familiar with productivity from another lecture, this then fits in nicely where they can see how they can kind of just change something slightly and get a different result. So let's go through a few more on the color television. Here's the original color television. This is a 1954 RCA 12-inch color television from 1954. First color television on the market. Unfortunately, most of the broadcasts you were going to get are not actually in color, but if there happened to be a color broadcast, you actually would have been able to watch it in color in 1954. That cost $1,000 in 1954. Like $1,000. So cost even more than the probably better TV from 1971. And of course, we would know that, well, in 1954, the wage would have been even lower than in 1971. So average hourly wage for the entire country was $1.97 per hour, which would mean it took 562 hours to purchase that. That's essentially 1/4 of the year working full time, right? That's over 3 months of work full time to purchase this. You can see why most people probably would not have had that television in their homes. If you're going to have to spend almost as much as, say, buying a new car to get a television, most people aren't going to buy it, right? So we can also compare the prices to other products. But what I really want to focus on here is the hours. 562 hours. What is that? 17 years later, the price has dropped from 562 hours to 174 hours. Right? So in a very short period of time, very dramatic decrease in the cost of purchasing this. And of course, the product in 1971 is going to be better in some ways than the product in 1954. Okay, and at this point, the students say, okay, old timer. And I am an old timer. A guy earlier was asking me earlier, he said, I bet I graduated from college before you were born. And I said, I'll tell you when I was born. And he said, oh, I guess I didn't, right? But I'm an old timer too. Okay, just look very young. That's why we have the mustache, so I look a little older. They say, okay, old timer, tell me about what's going on now though, right? The 50s, 70s out, what's going on now, right? Well, here is, not the only television day, here is a possible television that you might buy. This is something you can get at Walmart. This is a 49-inch LG flat screen LED television. It's not top of the line. This is actually on the lower end. It's not the cheapest television you can get. But this television, anyone know how much it would cost to purchase this LG 49-inch LED TV? Guess? 500? Anyone? Yeah, between 300 and 500. I think this was about this was $328 for this one. So it would cost $328 to purchase this television. The average wage, again, for the whole country today is $22.62, which would mean it would take 14 and a half hours to purchase that. In other words, 1/10 of the amount of time, or 1/12 or so of the amount of time it took in 1971, and 1/23 of the time it would take in 1954 to buy, in these cases, which was, I think, almost by any measure, an inferior product. I guess maybe this one still is working. Maybe it lasts longer. But even if it lasts longer, in the time it took to buy this, you could have made enough. You could have, if you worked 562 hours, you could have bought 23 of these, right? 23 of these in the same amount of time it took to buy one. So even if it burns out every year, right? You have one for 23 years of this. Of course, they last more than a few years. So we can start to see it. I mean, this is a new technology. So new technologies are a little different, in the sense that, well, not only is the price going down in money, the wages are going up, so of course it's going to take fewer hours, right? We'll look at some products where both the price is going up and the wages are going up to look at some different comparisons. But here we can see very dramatic falling in the cost of living over time, certainly from the 1950s as well as from the 1970s. Now at this point I will say that some might look at this and say, wow, $22.62 an hour, especially if your students might have been working a minimum wage job over the summer. They say that's almost 3 times what I make per hour, right? Who's making $22.62 an hour? So this is the average wage for what are called production and non-supervisory workers. So basically it doesn't include management, doesn't include people like that. But perhaps you might think in some cases this is not the relevant wage to use, and students might even point this out. And if they do, that's a really good student. You want to get them to talk more. You can use anything here, right? You could cross all these out and put in, say, the minimum wage, right? Have them look up, what's the legal minimum wage from 1954? What's the legal minimum wage today? And then after that, because it's just division, they can redo the calculation themselves, right? You could say, what's the wage for teenagers? What's the wage in Arkansas, right? What's the median wage rather than the average wage, right? Then you could start thinking about medians and averages, right? The difference between those. So I think there's a lot, because it's such a simple calculation, there's a lot you could swap these numbers out for almost anything. Or you could have them, as we'll do in our module, or in our exercise at the end of the module, you can have them find their own products, right? Maybe they say, I don't want that TV. Why would I want a big TV? I don't have to move that every time I move, and I don't have room for it in my dorm room. Like, why would I want this TV, right? You could have them do with other products as well, and that's what we'll do in our exercise at the end. Okay, so questions so far, or comments?
Sharon told me that the Walmart TV is actually cheaper than that. She was looking.
It was on sale yesterday. My husband needs a new TV. I go to the clearance of the sale.
How much was it?
Yeah, it was less than $200, I think.
Wow. Okay. Well, we have for a module. We don't have the Walmart. We got some Target. We got some Best Buy ads. We could see everything. It gets it on Amazon Prime Day. All kinds of things. Yes, sir.
Where'd you come up with the $22.62 average wage?
That comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Certainly not in Arkansas.
Yeah, in Arkansas it's about $19. Average wage in Arkansas is $19.
It is?
It's $19.50 about, yeah. So that's from 2017. So
Okay.
that's the average. And the median's different. So in Arkansas, the median's about $14.50, right? So the median's going to be lower than the average. And the minimum wage is $8.25, right? So there's lots of different things they could use, but this is for for the entire country. And I use this because this is the one where you can go back the furthest and find the data. Like if you want to use the median wage in Arkansas for teenagers or something very specific, you can maybe go back about 15 years. You can't get it back to the 50s. This is one where you can go back to the 50s and you can see how much it's changed for the average one. But it is good to think about what other numbers can we plug in there. So that's the average wage for people that aren't supervisors. Essentially, this covers about 90% of the workforce. So it's for the 90% of the workforce that's not supervisors for the entire country. That's the average wage. The median for the whole country is about $19. So it's what you use, matters, but I think you'll still see this trend, whatever number you put in. But in our exercise, we're actually going to use the average teenage wage rather than the average wage for everyone. Again, is that, might want what's the average teenage wage in Arkansas? Maybe that would be a little more relevant, but the more specific you try to get, the less data there is. But good question. Other questions? All right, well, let's proceed. Let's go to something maybe a little more basic than a television. Let's look at the price of beef. This is also useful to look at because this is something where the price, measured in money, actually has gone up over time, right? So for TVs, I think people know, well, the price is going down, so of course it's cheaper in hours. What about something where the price is going up? What about some kind of food that's a basic staple of life? So here is the green line. This shows you in the money of the day, right, of the time, going back to 1919, what was the price of 1 pound of beef, right? What's the price of a pound of beef? That's the green line. As you can see today here, right, we've got our dollars on this axis in green. Depending on whether you get 80-20 or 90-10 beef, somewhere between $4 and $5 is what a pound of beef costs today. Of course, it's on sale, might be less, but somewhere in that range, right? $4 to $4.50. If we go back to say the 1920s and 30s, right, it's going to be a little less than 25 cents for that pound of beef, right? So that's what it was back then. Today, now it's up over $4 or $5 sometimes. But what does that cost if we measure it in terms of people's time? Again, using that average wage because it's the one we can get back to 1919. We can see with this black line, it would take about 30 minutes of your time to purchase the pound of beef in 1919. If you look by, say, the 50s and 60s, it's going to cost, it's going to take about 15 to 20 minutes of your time. And today, it's now going to take about 11 minutes of your time. Although if you look at, in the past few years, I think as people that, buy beef, and clearly I like to buy beef, no, it's gone up quite a bit in the past few years, right? So it actually has been lower, right, from the 90s up until about, 5 or 6 years ago. It was about 7 or 8 minutes of your time. Now it's gone up a little bit, right? So I don't think the thing you should necessarily walk away from this lecture is that, oh, things always go down, always, everywhere, all the time. We're trying to look at general trends, right? And the general trend is since the 1920s and even since the 1950s, the price of beef has gone down in terms of hours worked, but not in every year. And sometimes we can see periods of time where it has gone up a lot, right? Here, or right here, right? During World War II, the price is going up a lot in terms of hours worked. But the general trend over time is we see that decreasing. Some might always wonder that, are we in some sort of new environment here where it's now going up a lot every year? And time will tell, right? But then we can start to talk about other things like substitutes, like if the price of beef is going up, what do people do? Well, they buy more chicken or they become vegetarians, right? So how do the prices affect people's behavior? That's another thing. There's lots of things that kind of can plug into this. Of course, people don't just buy beef. They buy lots of other food products. So here is a kind of basic basket of groceries you might buy at a typical trip to the store. In many ways, the same basket of goods you could have bought back in 1919. Right? So to buy this basket of, I think we got about a dozen items here, tomatoes, eggs, sugar. Wow, that's a lot of sugar. 5 pounds of sugar. You must be making a lot of cakes for the week. Okay, a pound of bacon, dozen oranges. You could buy all those things in 1919. You could buy all those things today. How many hours of work would it take to buy that entire basket? We could see that it would have taken about 9.5 hours of work to buy that basket in 1919. and it only takes about 1.5 hours to buy that basket today, right? So even though some things, right, remember we saw the price of beef had gone up in terms of hours lately, other things must have gone down so that it's pretty, look, even since about 1980, it's pretty stable, right, at about 1.5 hours of work to buy, essentially a week's or a few days worth of groceries, depending on how big your family is. How about a new home? So, with the food, there's probably the quality changes are very small. With the television, the quality changes I think are pretty big, even in a short period of time. But a home, which for most people is going to be the biggest single purchase they ever make in their life. How do we measure the quality of the home? Right? If you think about a home in 1920 compared to a home today, it's very different in almost every single way. So how do we measure it? One thing that we've done in this module is we've measured it in terms of square footage. In other words, how many hours do you have to work to buy 1 square foot of a home? Because the square footage changes over time, and maybe you want a bigger or smaller house than the average, but we can say how many hours would it take to buy a square foot of home space. We'll talk at the end of the home section about what amenities homes have. That's another important thing that's changed. But certainly, the definition of a square foot has not changed over time, right? So we can say, what was a square foot in 1920? What's a square foot today? How many hours would you have to work to buy that? And here's a typical home from 1920, about a little less than $5,000, right? Tell that to students. It was less than $5,000 to buy a home. But then you think, oh, but in 1950 it was also $1,000 to buy a television, right? So some things seem cheap, some things seem expensive, right? Putting it in terms of hours, I think, gives them a common denominator to think about it. So it would take close to 8 hours of work to buy a square foot of home, right? So I don't have the square footage listed here. It's listed at the end. But whatever the square footage of this was, it's much smaller than today. This is, I don't know if this is 700, 800 square feet. There's the price. Look at the average wage in 1920. It takes close to 8 hours of work to buy 1 square foot of home. So however many square feet you want in your home, you have to work that many days to buy it, right? Because it's about an 8-hour day of work. So you want a 1,000 square foot home, you got to work 1,000 hours to buy that home. Here's a perhaps typical home from the 1950s. There it's gone down a little bit from about 8 hours per square foot to about 6.5 hours per square foot. And if we look at some homes closer to the present, here's a home from 2014. This would be $282,000. That'd be on the high end in Conway, but there's certainly $300,000 homes in Conway. We don't quite have one, but people might have that at other places, perhaps in suburban Little Rock. There it's going to take about 5 hours of work per square foot. We went from in 1920 8 hours of work per square foot to about 5 hours of work per square foot. So it's come down. I mean, the decline in home prices is nowhere near as dramatic as, say, the decline in the price of beef or the decline in the cost of a television and other technologies. But still, even for that, it is per square foot cheaper to buy a home today. Now, most people probably are buying bigger homes than they were in the past. So maybe we need to factor that in. But also that's maybe a choice people are making because it is cheaper per square foot in terms of hours. So people might choose to buy a bigger home because of that. If we look at the amenities that homes have, I think this is something that really will jump out at a lot of students, especially if they've just gotten through the summer. And you say, okay, of new single-family homes in 1956, how many of them had, say, central air and heat? This is new homes. 6% of new homes in 1956 in the United States had central air and heat. Today, 91% do of new homes. That's a huge change, right? So you think, oh, the price per square foot, it's gone down a little bit. But also, almost all homes today have central air and heat. Almost no homes did in 1956. That's a big change, right? And that's a quality measure which is hard to quantify. How much is that worth to you? But certainly, when you say it's both cheaper per square foot and you get all this stuff with it, that's a big difference, right? For almost all these, except refrigerator, that's a weird one that, we bought our house here in Conway. Also, it didn't come with a fridge. It had all the appliances, but no fridge. I guess like pick your own fridge is like the name of the game. But, only 8% of new homes have a fridge, but of almost anything else, it's 80 or 90% of the appliances that a new home's going to have. And if we look at here the Median square foot for a new home in 1956 was a little over 1,000 square feet. Today, it's almost 2,500 square feet, right? So when you look at, people are spending more on homes in the past. That's because they're buying homes which are twice as big as they were in 1956. But again, they might be choosing to do that because per square foot is cheaper and you get more stuff with it. Meaning that if we compare these two times, and this is one of these things which I don't know how much your students will have heard this, but perhaps you've heard this, that, well, in the 50s it was easy, any family could buy a home on just a normal salary, and today it's impossible. Well, per square foot it's actually cheaper today, but most people aren't buying 1,000 square foot houses, right? So the reason it might be more challenging for people to buy them today is because the product has changed in some way that is maybe some people like it, some don't, but it's a different product. Even though a home is a home, it's just a roof over your head, but it has a lot of different things than it would have. I mean, look at this here, right? 1956, only a third of homes had insulation in the walls. Of new homes, this is not like taking into account stuff that was built in the 20s. New construction, single-family homes, only a third had insulation in the walls. I guess if it's not heated and cool, it doesn't really matter, right? But all right. Here's one kind of big picture. I think when we think about all these things we just talked about, especially food and shelter, what percent of a household's budget do they spend on shelter, food, and clothing? In 1901, around 1900, families are spending over 3/4 of their budget on just those things. Just food, clothing, and shelter. And remember, the shelter was not, very extravagant at the time. Probably were eating a lot less food as well. But they spent over 3/4. That means you only have 1/4 of your income, or you might think 1/4 of your time, left to purchase all the other things. Today, families spend about 30% of their income, or 30% of their time goes to paying for their food, clothing, and shelter. And notice that it's really only the shelter that hasn't come down very much. And now that's 2/3 of it, right? Of this, that's 20 out of 30. So to buy your basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter, really it's food and clothing are now just 10% of a typical family's budget, whereas they would have been over 50% in 1900. Right? So one of the things that this has meant over time is that people now have 70% of their income to spend on other stuff, right? Other stuff. What's the other stuff going to be? Well, it might be televisions, it might be vacations, it might be going to college, right? It might be all sorts of things. But in 1900, people didn't really have a choice of what are you going to spend your extra income on. There wasn't a whole lot of extra income. Most of your income just went to satisfying those very basic needs. Let me see here. I'm going to move through this a little quickly. Here, there's another clothes washer. There were actually, in the original modules SMU gave us, there were like 50 different examples. I'm like, we're not going to go through. They'll get the point after a few of these, right? But this one is interesting because if we look at the kind of original washing machine and how many hours it took to buy it, 553 hours. Look at a decent one in 1970, took 72 hours. Today it's 13 hours. But that's using the $300 one, from Sears, kind of a low-end one. What if you want a high-end washing machine? What if I want the, front-loading, high-efficiency, bigger one? What if I want that one with steam, right? Like you gotta have steam so you get the wrinkles out of your clothes. Okay, that one is $1,200, right? So we can say, well, there's different, right? If you're gonna buy your first washing machine, you could buy this one, or you could buy this one. This one is 4 times as much. But even if you want to buy this one, the high-end one today, that takes 52 hours of your time. To buy just an average one in 1970 took 72 hours of your time. So it takes less time, even if today you want to buy the high-end one, rather than just the basic model. So again, which one should we use? Well, in 1911, this is the only one available, the Thor electric washing machine, the first commercially available one. Most people wouldn't have that. Most people were doing it by hand. But in 1970, you might think, well, again, why pick on 1970? Again, there's this statistic that, well, median wages adjusted for inflation haven't increased since the 1970s, which would seem to say that, well, people are no worse off, but no better off than the 1970s. But when you can buy your washing machine for 1/7 of what it cost back then, or 1/6, or you can buy the high-end one for even less. That's a big difference. That's something those just basic wage statistics miss. All right, so there's a few examples. If we want to talk about the washing machines, or if we want to talk about cars, I don't have an example about cars, but if you want to talk about things like that, you also might want to know if you're, for a car, okay, what's the price of gas, right? What does it cost to use it? If you're talking about a washing machine, what's the price of electricity? Well, we have pretty good data on what it costs to buy a kilowatt hour of electricity going back to 1900, and we can see that it's about a third of what it was in terms of hours to buy, or a quarter of what it was to buy it compared to 100 years ago. Again, here not much change since the 1970s, but still pretty dramatic declines. And of course, a lot more appliances today are energy efficient, so it actually takes less energy to use them than it would in the past. I think the Thor washing machine used a lot of electricity. So rather than going through all these examples, here's just a table to kind of show you different things. If we look at, say, what it cost to buy a cruise in 1972, what it cost to buy a cruise today, this number tells us it costs about 40% in terms of how many hours it would take, right? So it takes fewer hours. If one of these was 110, that would mean it cost more. But nothing on this table, at least, is above 100, right? And this, pick an early year, compare it to, we updated to 2015. You can see everything is cheaper, although some things get a lot cheaper, right? Computing power, a lot cheaper. Phone call, a lot cheaper. But if we look at, a new home, or we look at a movie, a little bit cheaper, but not a whole lot, right? So how much things went down varies a lot depending on the type of product. But see here, for most things on this list, things have gone down. But what you might be wondering, and I hope what your students will wonder at this point is, are we cherry picking the examples here? Is anything gone up? And of course, the answer is yes. And if you ask students to pick something, or maybe we'll ask you, what's something you think has gone up in terms of how many hours it takes to buy it? Healthcare would be a good one, right? Healthcare is a little tricky to measure because what do you like? What's the thing, right? I mean, a dishwasher is a dishwasher. What is healthcare? It's not in a box. I can pick it up, right? But yeah, what's the cost of a typical insurance policy? Although, what you get with a typical insurance policy today, most of those procedures weren't available in the 1970s. But you could say, what's the cost of typical insurance? You might say, okay, what's the cost of a treatment of penicillin, right? A drug that was available back then, right? You could do that, but healthcare is one which I think by most measures it probably has gone up. Other things, what else can you think of?
Funerals?
A cost of a funeral? Okay, I have not priced that out, but perhaps it has, right? Maybe that's kind of like the home, where there's only so much land, right? So anything that takes a certain plot of land, that probably there's only so much land, right? So that's either not going to go down as fast or maybe even go up. Okay, other things?
Has higher education gone up? I don't know.
That's a good one, higher education, right? Here we are at a university, and your students maybe are thinking about going on to higher education. This is actually one. This is the one I picked, college tuition. So here's a counterexample, right? So we have a lot of them where the price has gone down, some faster, some slower in terms of hours. If we look at the price of a college education, if we look at annual tuition and fees for a full-time student here at the University of Central Arkansas, in 1975, annual tuition and fees for the entire year was $414. Today, annual tuition fees is $8,500. That's for this upcoming academic year, $8,500 for tuition fees. And of course, none of this includes books or housing, but you had to buy books and housing in 1975 too. So we just look at tuition and fees, right? Like the bare minimum you would have to pay to go to college. In 1975, average wage was $4.61. That means it would take 90 hours of work to buy 1 year of schooling. Essentially, 2 weeks working full-time, right? If you're a full-time worker making the average wage, you'd only have to work for 2 weeks to pay for a year's worth of college, right? Or if you're a part-time student worker, maybe this is like half of your summer, right? You gotta work half your summer to pay for the next year of college. Today, to buy a year's worth of schooling, it takes 382 hours. So almost 4 times as much in terms of how many hours you would have to work to buy a year's worth of college tuition.
Both of those are things that the national government has gotten involved in.
That's true, although it's hard for me to think of anything that the national government isn't involved in. Yes, financing, although again, many things are involved in financing, but yes. So, right, but this is one where then, either I think students will naturally come up with this, or you can come up, like if you want to do a healthcare one, you could plug that in too, right? Just find a price of something from 1970s, find a price today, do the division, and you can come up with good counterexamples to this. And then get them to think about, why is that, right? Is it something about the way it's financed, right? Like, why is it 4 times as much as it was in the past, right? And if we think about, okay, in the past people spent, 3/4 of their income on their basic needs. So they only spend 1/3 on their basic needs. What's the excess going to? A lot of it's going to stuff like this: higher education, healthcare, maybe funerals, right? It's going to other stuff. So why? So to get students to start thinking about this, they're going to come up with all kinds of ideas. And the beauty of this is no one actually knows. Like, economists that study this still debate, like, why is the price of this going up? Like, people debate this, right? And there are a lot of good answers. We don't know which one is right, but so to get students to think about this I think is a really good exercise in itself, to just think about, why have these few things gone up and why have others not? (1975). That was the first year that UCA was called UCA. Before that, it was Arkansas Teachers College. Before that, it was Arkansas Normal School. But that's UCA's first year, $414, and they didn't increase it for 2 years. It was flat at that, even though there was a lot of inflation at that point, and they kept tuition flat for 2 years. So amazing to see. Don't tell the students here today. That's a one-class cost, right? And don't tell the parents. Oh. Okay. So I've got about less than 10 minutes here. Let me try to wrap up. If we look at all goods and services, in terms of how many dollars it costs to buy things, say go all the way back to 1900, it's going to cost about 16 times as much to buy all the things that people buy, right? If you just look at dollars. But if you measure it in money, or excuse me, take away the money, you measure it in hours, it takes about 1/8 of the number of hours to say buy. Look at what we're doing here is saying, look at everything the average person bought in 1900. This is their entire income, right? They spent their entire income on all this stuff. How many hours would you have to work to buy all that same stuff? And you have to work about 1/8 of the number of hours, right? So if it took, 2,000 hours to buy all that stuff, it's going to take, someone do the division for me, but it's going to take 1/8 of that, right? A little more than 1 month of your time to buy all that same stuff. And then again, you have then the rest of your year's income to spend on other things. So when you look at it in terms of dollars, of course, we know most things have gone up, TVs have gone down, but most things have gone up in terms of dollars. But if we look at everything that people were buying over 100 years ago, today it would take 1/8 of the number of hours to purchase it. If we look at over time, what's happened to consumption per person, this means that people now are spending a lot more. Incomes have gone up, but so has consumption, such that even if we think about just the past couple decades, so since the 1980s, average consumption, right, how much are you spending? Now here we actually have it adjusted for inflation. Adjusted for inflation here, how much are you spending? People are spending about twice as much as they were in the 1980s and 3 times as much as they were in the 1960s. So consumption, even adjusted for inflation, has gone way up. This is one way that we sometimes, this is a pretty traditional way of measuring an increase in the standard of living. If I go back one slide, this is kind of the way I've done it in this module, is to say, let's measure it in work hours, right? What does it mean to say consumption has doubled since the 1980s? Well, what it means is that it takes a lot fewer hours, even if you go back to the 1980s, to buy things than today. And then we always like to, get students to think about, why is this? What makes this possible? What system is this? And sometimes this might seem like an old debate, but I think, if you read the papers all lately, people are, especially young people, are starting to think about what other economic systems are there other than capitalism, right? I think if 10 years ago, people might have said, oh yeah, capitalism, everyone's capitalist, and that's just like the only thing, and it has flaws, but like that's it. But I think today, this is students are interested in this. They're interested in what are other economic systems either that are out there in the world or that have been tried or that haven't been tried. They're new ideas. So I'll just, for the last 5 minutes, talk about this. What is it about capitalism that that allows this to happen. How many of you ever said, I'm not going to buy this right now, I'm going to wait for the price to come down? Have you ever done that? Say, I want to buy this, but maybe I'll wait for it to go on sale. I'll wait for the new model to come out. I think we've all done this for, maybe even have done this, I guess, don't try this for a house because it's probably not going to ever come down, right? But for most things, you could maybe wait, prices can come down, right? What we see for all these products we've talked about, right, if everyone waited, nothing would ever get developed. What we see is that essentially people with high incomes, rich people, are the first ones to buy things, right? They're the first adopters of a lot of products. And in some cases, like buying something like a television, a color television in 1954, most people would say, why are you wasting $1,000 on a thing that gets maybe 3 channels and none of it's even really in color? Like, why are you wasting that money? But when people buy those, the early adopters, rich people buy those, what that does is it allows companies to then continue producing these to lower costs so they become available to everyone. That's a built-in feature of our capitalist system that in some sense you might think of as a transfer system of transferring the money those stupid rich people spend on stuff that then companies use to make things cheaper, and then it becomes available to everyone. It's essentially a transfer system from rich to poor, which when people think about alternate systems, we think, well, capitalism is just you're all on your own, and if you're rich, you get stuff. If you're poor, you don't. And other systems are the ones that transfer income. Capitalism actually has this built into the system where it has its own kind of subtle transfers from rich to poor. One of the first automobiles here. Why do you even need this? Why can't you just walk, right? But today, automobiles, almost every household has one. Many households today have more automobiles than people. If we look at over time, and some of these, like here's the clothes washer that we talked about. Do we have television on here? No, I didn't put but we have telephone. Oh, it's so many lines. Color TV right here, right? This is what % of households have these different products, right? Color TV, clothes washer, telephone. What we can see is that certainly over time, more households are acquiring these. That's something we can definitely see for all these. But what we can see is that for a lot of them, the period between when no one had it, say no one had a microwave before 1973, and the period to which almost everyone has it, is often very short, like a decade, right? It's not that, well, okay, the rich people can buy it, and then 100 years later we'll all be able to get it, right? Sometimes this happens very quickly, especially with new technologies. If you look at, air conditioning, right? I mean, basically no households had it, right? Say, why didn't new households have it? Like, no one had it before 1950. And then you see here the burst comes kind of in the 1960s. That goes from basically no one before that to by the end of the 60s, half of households have it, right? These can change very quickly, and that happens for, again, not everything, but for many things, this is the pattern that we observe, right? So this is the conclusion that's in the module, but I think this is an overlooked feature of the economic system we have, capitalism, that it does lead to not only the rich getting richer, but also that the things the rich buy in one generation, which are a luxury, become very common by 1 or 2 generations later. And that is not an accident. That's something we see again and again, and there's a reason for that. And I think that people often focus on the counterexamples, right? The college tuition or the healthcare. But for most things, this is the case. They become cheaper over time, and there's something about our system that actually makes that possible. All right, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. And now you're going to get a chance to play with some of the data I've looked at. Anyone have any questions, though, before your last comments?
There's a video, I don't know, but it uses cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
And like the first cell phones were $1,000, and all they could do was call people. There was no text.
If that.
They would call. That's it.
Well, and you had to tell them. You had to call the operator and say, someone's near this tower. Like, ping me to that tower, right?
Okay.
You can do this for a lot of things, right? I think the new technology, students kind of get it, right? That original cell phone cost $1,000 and didn't do much. A new iPhone today it's still $1,000, but look at all it does, right? So, good. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? This one's called Time Well Spent. So if you can find the It's just one worksheet, and it has, here's what you should see. It's got 2 tables, and then you're to create the third table. So what we're essentially asking here is, for teenagers, how much does 5 weeks worth of work buy, right? So if you can find that sheet it's got a table for 1950 and a table for 1970. And what we're going to do in this exercise is to have you walk through that. And this is again, this is a handout which you could give this to students to have them do it. Yeah, it's just a loose sheet. It's not in the it's not in the book. I mean, it's in the book too, but there's a loose sheet.
Yeah, we didn't want to use the one in the book.
Oh, that's, yeah. So you can read through it, right? It's got a little background, and then it gives you this table from 1950, gives you another table from 1970, and then asks you to answer a few questions. So think through those questions. But the big part of the exercise is for you then to fill in a table for 5 weeks worth of work in the wages for today. Or what did we say, 2015? Something, yeah.
2015, yep.
Yeah, so we give you the average wage for teenagers in all these 3 years. And then we're going to, for the exercise, your job is to go through and see what could someone buy with 5 weeks worth of work at the average teenage wage today. And the way you're going to do that is, if you've got a cell phone with internet access, as many of us have now today, you can go to Amazon and look for things, or we're handing out some ads. We've got a Best Buy and a Target ad. You can look through those. But the main exercise for this, in addition to answering those few questions before the table, is to basically say, how much stuff can you get, right? So how many things can you get? You could try to think of, both these examples from 1950 and 1970 have a television and a stereo system, or a portable radio in 1950. But pick whatever things you would want, or you think a teenager might want today, and see how much stuff you can get. See if you can fill up that table with stuff using both your internet access or the advertisements you have in front of you. And we'll give you guys maybe 15 minutes to work on that, and then we'll come back and see what you got. So maybe we'll go to about 10-15 of you just kind of finding stuff. It's actually, this is a real challenge to fill out the list and to spend all your money. But I'm sure you can do it. So go ahead, do that, and let me know if you have questions. Thank you. Okay, so the volume level is going up. That must mean you guys are talking about fun things. That must mean we're done. All right, so how many of you were able to spend all of your money? How many were able to do that? Yes. How many of you couldn't do it? You're like, I can't find enough stuff. Okay, okay. How many of you think you got a big, long list? Who thinks they have the longest list? Okay. Did you spend it all? Oh, yeah. Okay, he got it all. Okay. Well, you threw in the big thing at the end, the washing machine. But all right. Very good. Okay, so yes, so it is possible to spend it all, but it's a lot of work, right? I mean, think about what we're doing here is 5 weeks worth of work in 1950, 5 weeks worth of work in 1970, and then 5 weeks worth of work, at roughly today's teenage wage. Here's the list I put together. I had more time to work on this, so I was able to do it. But I had to, stick in some things like a robot vacuum cleaner, right? Which they probably don't really actually need. Although we just got one and we love it. The kids love it too. It's like a toy almost. Our floors are cleaner than they've ever been. So it is possible to do this. But if you look at all the stuff you can get with that, this is again, it's 200 hours of your time as a teenager, right? 5 40-hour weeks, 200 hours of your time. Here's what you could have got in 1950. 4 things, and I think if you were a teenager and had all these things, you'd be a pretty cool kid, right? You'd have all the latest technologies. Here in 1970, again, college student might have these things, right? Got to have that electronic adding machine, calculator, right? Which now is on your phone, of course, right? And then today, a lot of more things. So, anyone surprised by anything? Either, how expensive something was or how cheap something was? Anyone have anything that jumped out at them?
I remember when I bought we had to get a stereo for our dorm room.
Mm-hmm.
That was ridiculously expensive. There was a retro stereo for $69.88, had all the speakers, but now it was Bluetooth compatible. You
Mhm.
could stick an HD card or an SD card in it,
And so that's
it was $69
Good on a deal.
and so what would you have paid for that when you would have bought it in college?
I think the stereo was like $500.
Mhm. Yeah, many times more in terms of dollars, but then when you look at hours, even less, right? Right. So the fact that, and we're looking at newer technologies here, the fact that a lot of them have decreased in dollar terms, that's why the list is so much longer, right? Yeah, okay. Other things? Anyone surprised by anything else?
Thinking about how they wouldn't necessarily last as long.
Yeah, some might not last as long, right?
But you tended to gravitate toward finding the cheapest thing or what was on sale, the maximum.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Production, higher production, cheaper materials, cheaper quality.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, they want you to come back. Although I don't actually mind, right? Because I know that if my phone's going to wear out in 2 years, it's no big deal because the phone I can buy in 2 years is much better than the one I can buy now. So I'm actually okay with that sometimes, right? But I like my my iron to last a long time. There's not much new in iron technology, I don't think, but or ironing board technology. But, okay. Other things that surprised you or thoughts?
It's a marketing too. I mean, one click on the website, you have a list of everything a student would need, all right there in one place.
Well, you used to have that. You had the Sears catalog, right? The Sears, that was the same thing, right? You carry that around with you. Updates once a year. Okay, good. Yeah, so I think hopefully this is something which students can. I like this activity because students can actually create their own list, and I think the list the students create is going to be different from the one you create. I mean, would a student even want a robot vacuum cleaner? Probably not, right? I mean, they don't care about that, right? So you see, like they get to pick what they care about, but go back to that fundamental lesson that this is 400 hours of your time you have given up, and here is the stuff you've got in exchange, and think about was that a good use of your money? So there's maybe some personal finance involved here. Maybe you want to save some of it, like you said. Like I'm not going to spend it all. I want to save something, right? Like that's another choice you could make, right? That you want to save the money but then what are you going to spend it on, right? Maybe you're saving it for college because you saw the college bill is so big, right? So, but there's a lot of choice involved here, and I think that makes it at least the students will see it as something that it's not like you're giving them pick 5 from this list and then that's your thing. Like they can customize their list, and I think students tend to like that as long as they don't go too crazy on the cell phones. I think having the Best Buy ads probably helps a little bit to focus them. But any other questions or comments on this module? Yes, sir.
How do you explain inflation to your students?
How do you explain inflation? Well, it's hard, but here's how I try to do it. I try to do it, related to this. So I try to say, when we think of inflation, what we really mean is when prices go up, that means the purchasing power of a dollar goes down, right? So when you have inflation, that means that the money you had earned in the past now buys less stuff, right? So any money you had saved, when there's inflation, now essentially the hours you'd put in are worth less if there's more inflation. But I think that the other thing to think about with inflation is that inflation both increases prices and wages, right? So we're interested in what's the ratio, right? If prices and wages are both going up at the same pace, well, you're no worse off or no better off. But if prices are going up faster than wages, that's where it really starts to hurt people, right? So I think you can use this to talk about inflation too. And that's how I try to do it. I say, inflation, prices going up, you just flip that over, that's dollar value going down, right? But that applies to dollars you have earned in the past, dollars you've saved. Dollars you earn now, your wages are probably going up faster as well if there's a lot of inflation. Good question. Okay, so this is one of the modules that we've done. We've got 2 more today we're going to go through. We hope to eventually roll out more of these, right? Like we said earlier, these were developed in Texas, but we're now adapting them both to Arkansas standards and to try to, where we can, make them like I put the UCA tuition. They didn't even have a tuition thing in here, so I put in the UCA tuition to make it a little more Arkansas relevant. But we hope to roll out more of these, so we're always interested to see if you guys actually do use these and or if there are particular types of exercises that you would find useful in your class. So More feedback is always better. We can always just ignore if you don't have good comments. No, all the comments are appreciated, and thanks for your time.